but most humor actually builds bridges. And being teased, I mean, you and I have talked about this, that for an English person, some of your deepest friends will call you, you know, McGilchrist, you old fart, or whatever. And if they started being terribly careful and polite with me, I think, have I alienated them in some way? And so humor is, in fact, being able to share a joke immediately lowers the tension between parties that are otherwise sure that they must be right and the other person must be wrong.
So I'm thrilled to welcome you to this next session where we will have the unique privilege of hearing from John Cleese and Dr. Iain McGilchrist, whose friendship...
Dr. John Cleese.
Oh, that's true, because you're
honorary doctor
Professor.
of law.
From Cornell.
Professor too, but honorary doctor of law from St. Andrews. When I was rector there. Yeah. So Dr. Cleese, carry on.
Dr. Cleese. Very good, Dr. Cleese. So their combined experience promised to offer us profound insight and fun into the nature of humor. So neither of you require much of an introduction, but I will try. John Cleese. Dr. John Cleese is a legendary figure in the world of comedy. He has used humor in innovative and absurd ways to make us both laugh and think differently about the world. An actor, producer, and writer, you may know him as Basil Fawlty, Sir Lancelot, or Archie Leach. His work with the iconic comedy group Monty Python revolutionized comedy and set new standards for what comedy could be and could do. In my personal favorite film, The Life of Brian, humor is used to challenge norms. John takes on issues like religious dogma, conformity, and historical revisionism, all while wearing a headdress and robes. John was offered a CBE, which is a Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire for his comedy genius, which he declined. He said that it was...
Americans are baffled.
Apparently, you said it was too silly.
I said, because I got the message from number 10 Downing Street, I said, if I accept, am I entitled to call myself Commander Cleese? You know, like Commander Bond. And they said no. And I said, what's this British Empire you're talking about? I didn't know we still had one. And they said, well, we still got the Falkland Islands. And I said, I don't want to be a commander of Falkland Islands.
It's excellent. Thank you. So he remains John Cleese with no letters after his name except doctor before. So John Cleese also wrote a book on creativity, and I learned that you're a visiting scholar at Cornell University. He's also very fond of lemurs. Because of his work on their protection and preservation, a species of lemur was named after John Cleese called Avahi cleesi, or Cleese's woolly lemur.
Cleese's woolly lemur.
Yeah, pretty cool. So Dr. Iain McGilchrist, whose brilliant keynote we heard on Friday, is a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and philosopher and author renowned for his work on the hemispheres. Dr. McGilchrist has argued that we are a left hemisphere-obsessed civilization fixated on certainty and facts, the consequence of which has been a stifling of creativity and a loss of meaning. To address this crisis, he believes we must focus on developing the ways of the right hemisphere. Creativity, according to Dr. McGilchrist, is crucial for this development, and he describes humor as particularly valuable to foster creativity, empathy, and resilience. He has described comedians as akin to poets because they use language and wit to subvert and enrich our understanding and reveal deeper truths about the world. Together, they will discuss the nature of humor. So welcome so much, Iain and John.
little did I think when I was an Oxford undergraduate, queuing with lots of other people outside the JCR to get a glimpse of the television, with John doing silly walks and so on, that one day I'd be sitting here as a sort of stooge man for John. But I'm very old, as you probably know.
Oh, come on.
Almost as old as he is.
No, you're not.
And
I'm 84. What are you, Ian?
I remember when I was young, in 1605, there was a play put on by a chap called Thomas Middleton called A Mad World, My Masters. I've had a great deal to think about in that respect since, and I haven't stopped laughing. And as I get older, one of the great consolations is the existence of humor. Yeah. And it's actually the only thing that makes life worth living. And even the idea of death fills me with glee. People say, you seem so optimistic. The reason is that I do laugh a lot, but I'm not an optimist. I'm a pessimist. That's why I laugh a great deal at the absurdities of life and the absurdities all around us, and try to see the funny side of them. Yeah. So I want to say to John, because it is true, I do commonly say, and have said to John more than once, I consider a great comic like yourself to be up there with the great poets. They give us much to enrich our lives, and they do it through this process that poetry does, of setting light to various different meanings which are suddenly revealed to us, and there's a joy, a shock of surprise, an aha moment when we see something new, which also comes from the best poetry. So I wanted to ask you, John, when did you first realize that you could make people laugh, and that this was the way, rather than physics or the law, towards which I think you had inclinations? Why was this going to be your life?
Well, it's pure luck, because to answer the second bit first, I mean, I was at lower middle class family. My dad sold insurance out of a 10 horsepower car, and we lived in Somerset. And it was a very peaceful, quiet, decent existence, and I look back on it with a lot of affection. My father had a very nice sense of humor, but it was very dry. I remember we were in a restaurant once and the service was very slow, and he called the waiter over and said, "Could you try and hurry up our meal because I have an operation to perform at 3 o'clock." And it was so out of the blue. And of course it worked like a treat. And I remember another occasion, we were driving around the very windy roads in Somerset, and you hit your horn every kind of 20 seconds to let people know literally that you're coming. And somebody who hadn't been hitting his horn shot round the corner, screamed to a halt, only just missed us, driving much too fast. And then they leapt out of their car, ran over to ours, and started belaboring my father and saying, "What are you doing driving like that? I've never seen such stupid, awful driving in my life." And he went on like this. And at the end, my father said, "Aha, you are a fine old English gentleman, no?" And he said, "As a matter of fact, I am." Got back in the car. So he had this very quiet sense of humor. We were watching a really boring dance routine once, and he said to me, "I don't think this will ever replace entertainment." So he was like that. Mother, on the other hand, had a very black sense of humor. And I only discovered this later on, but she was quite a depressed woman. And if you've got a depressed mother, you always sort of feel you ought to be cheering her up or doing something about it. And of course, it doesn't work. But I remember one occasion, and this is absolutely true, after my dad died, she was carefully listing the reasons why she didn't want to go on living. And I suddenly said, a moment of inspiration, I said, "Mum, I have an idea." And she said, "Oh, what is that?" And I said, "I know a little man in Chelsea, and if you're still feeling this way next week, I could give him a call if you like, but only if you like, and he could come down to the retirement home and kill you." There was a startled silence. And then she shrieked with laughter. It was absolutely wonderful. So after that, whenever she said she was depressed, I would say, well, after time, I'd say, should I call the little man in Fulham? And she'd say, oh, no, I got a sherry party on Friday. So there was humor in the house.
Operation at 3, yes.
Yes, that's right, yes. But I do remember that I think I was very tall, and I lived a very solitary life.
You can't have been. You know,
I
look at you.
was 6 foot when I was 12.
Thank
I
you.
was taller than all of the teachers, so that meant you stuck out a bit, which is not necessarily what you want to do when you're a young boy. You can't fade into the background. I remember I was bullied a little bit because I wasn't very social. We kept moving house and I hadn't made any steady friendships. So when I first got to school, and I discovered fairly early on that if I could make them laugh, there's immediate acceptance if you could make somebody laugh. And I remember doing what was like a weather forecast about the mood of the teacher who was just coming to teach us. Do you see what I mean? And that's the first memory I have. But of course, it never occurred to me that I'd finish up in this business, because if you grew up in Weston-super-Mare, you were as likely to become a matador. It just wasn't on. And when I got into Cambridge, I joined a club called the Footlights Club, which has been going for a long time, and it was people who were interested in review, and we did sketches, and we had a little club room with a stage, and I joined that, but I hadn't the slightest intention I was going to be a lawyer. And my very last year at Cambridge, we did a show at the local professional theatre. And it was very good. I wasn't the star of the show. There were 2 other guys called Tim Brooke-Taylor and Bill Oddie. And after one of the shows, we went back to the club room, and there was a man sitting in a suit who said, I want to put this show on in the West End. And we all said, what? And he did. He took this little student review, put it on in the West End. We ran for 5 months. And at the end of it, we all had jobs in show business because it was very nice. I didn't have to wear a collar and tie when I went to work, so I was very happy.
Was that the only reason you didn't want to be a lawyer?
No, there were lots of reasons. Because the thing about lawyers is, as you know, they become very successful and very, very wealthy, and then they kill themselves.
Yes.
And there's a very good reason why they kill themselves, because the study of law is very enlightening, but the study of how you can get the other side to bear all the costs is not very interesting. So I'm glad I escaped from that.
I think you could have gladdened a lot of lawyers' hearts in the courtroom. I mean, it's a marvelous place for pulling off a one-liner.
It is, yeah.
You know the one that F.E. Smith did when he's saying, he's prosecuting. He said, it's quite clear, and he was before a judge who had a reputation for, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yes. And he said, it's quite clear that the defendant was as drunk as a judge. And the judge said, I think, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Smith, that the expression is as sober as a judge, as drunk as a lord. As you wish, my lord.
He had an extraordinary sense of humor, because there was one judge he was always fighting with,
Yes.
and he presented the case at the very beginning, and it was a very long presentation. And at the end of it, the judge said, "Well, thank you, Mr. Smith. You've been speaking for nearly 5 hours, and I must admit, I am none the wiser." And Smith said, "None the wiser, my lad, but a great deal better informed." So there is a lot of good humor.
In there.
Do you know that he was once defending he was once defending a bus company who'd been sued by a boy, and they claimed that the bus had knocked the boy over and that he couldn't use his arm properly.
Oh, right.
Yes, and Smith was asking him, and he said, tell me, you can't raise your arm properly now. Can you show us? And the boy said, well, I can't do it. And he said, oh, that's awful. How high could you hold it before the accident? He said, oh, I could put it right up. No more questions for that.
Yes.
How do we get onto that?
I don't know. But yes, tell me about your attitude to humor, because I think we agree that humor is not just peripheral to life. No. We've talked about this, and I think people think of it as somehow a fringe entertainment. But I believe it's at the core of what makes a life worth living. And it reminds me slightly of people who work in the city under stripped lighting, making lots of money by betting. And then they go, oh, well, we better go to Covent Garden and see Figaro or something. Yeah. And then they think of that as the bit of, fantasy. But actually, the fantasy is what they're doing all day, every day, and which eventually kills them. And the one context in which they could see reality would be when they went to listen to Mozart.
Well, I think when I started, because I was Cambridge and snotty and all that, and I had all that set of values, I always thought to myself that comedy was perfectly nice, and I personally loved it and had favorite comedians, but I always thought of it as a sort of a luxury, a bit of an add-on. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? That you had the rest of life, and then you had a bit of laughter, and then I began to realize I think it's far, far more important than that. And this first of all occurred to me really quite dramatically. I was in Sarajevo for a film festival, and they told me about the period when they'd been besieged by the Serbs. The Serbs were up in the hills, Sarajevo's in the valley, and the Serbs were lobbing shells down. They had snipers, telescopic, they were shooting people who were crossing the street for 4 years, during which the EU did very, very little to help. And then they said, well, I said, how did you cope? And they said, well, we found an underground car park and we converted it into a cinema. And when it was dark and we could cross the roads, we go into the cinema and watch comedy, a lot of it Monty Python. And I thought, well, that's lovely. But I said, well, what was the result? And they said, well, when we came out, we felt better. And nothing had got better. Do you see what I mean? So the act of laughing had moved them to a part of their brain or mind where they could cope better with the awful situation that they were in. And one of the things that struck me very much recently, because I go to these Comic-Cons where you meet fans, is how many people have said to me, thank you for helping me through difficult periods of my life. And you never thought that, I never thought of myself as a comedy therapist, but a lot of people use comedy in this way, just basically to cheer themselves up. So, and as I went into for lunch today, a very nice girl, one of the people helping us, just came up and said, my dad died 2 years ago. My happiest memory is watching Fawlty Towers with him. So you suddenly realize that the comedy is a huge part of people's emotional life. It's not an add-on. It can really change attitudes. And I think when you laugh, you move to a part of your life where you can cope with life better. It's something to do with comedy or humor being a sense of proportion.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's one of the things that disappears as soon as you become touchy about humor, is that humor is a great way, not of diminishing things, but of getting them into perspective. And when you don't have humor, things become extreme positions. And humor is a very good way of modulating that, not ruling out the importance of what's being discussed, but bringing it back into a place where actually one can meet minds. And you said humor affects the emotions, and it does, but it's a wonderful thing. It sort of is a place where the intellect and the emotions very obviously coincide, as in poetry. And both of these things, I know you need to know all this, are subserved by the right frontal cortex. This is where sense of humour is. People who have damage to right frontal lobe very often take jokes literally. They look at cartoons and say, the first thing I'd like to know is how that elephant got into that tree, and things like that. And but it's also the area with which we understand poetry. And the reason is that both depend on rich implicitness. And they both evoke that. And once you're confined to literal meaning, and all your remarks are taken literally, the thing is destroyed. I apologize to all the Americans in the room here. This is not meant to be a slur on your fine nation, but when I went to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins to do neuroimaging in 1992, I made friends because Americans are very, very kind and hospitable in this lab where I was working. And I noticed that something very odd was happening. I would say something to people, and then they'd go, really? And I go, well, no, not really, but never mind. And so it actually threw me for a while, and then I realized I've got to just say literally what I mean. Because I hadn't realized quite how much of everything I say, and I think probably a lot of my friends and you too, has to be slightly decoded and taken with a pinch of salt, and that's part of the joy of it.
Well, one of the people used to ask me, what's the difference between an American sense of humor and an English sense of humor? And the answer was very little, unless we're talking about the Midwest. Because on the coasts, either coast and around the Great Lakes and in the big cities like Dallas, their sense of humor is, as far as I'm concerned, exactly like ours. It'll be the best reception I get is in Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. The shows go better there than they do in the Northeast. But the moment you get into the Midwest, you come across this literal mindedness where they don't get irony. And it's an extraordinary experience. And the trouble is, they tend to be quite vocal in their comments. And the way because after all, as a comedian, I'm on the end of some of the woke stuff. I mean, not the good end, which is be inclusive and kind, but there's another end which is not nice at all. I was told recently that there have been more academics fired as a result of things that they've said in the past than were ever fired during the McCarthy era. You see what I mean? So this is something I want to try and push back against. But what I don't know how to say it. What I've been saying is, should people who don't have much of a sense of humor be in a position to decide what people with a sense of humor can laugh at? It's very hard for them to argue with that one. But then I started to think, Iain, because I came across somebody who said that the basis of humor is change of context.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
That's part of it, isn't it?
That's a huge part of it.
You see it from a different point of view.
That's right. Well, there's a simple story. As a woman in an airport is doing a survey on sexual attitudes, and she sees a rather attractive pilot coming up and asking him a few questions. And then at the end says to him, may I ask the last time you had sexual intercourse? And he says, 2012. And she says 2012, and he says, well, it's only 2116 now. That's a perfect example of this change of context, and suddenly we laugh because the context. I then read in your book that the ability to understand change of context is very limited in, tell me what you said, because it was two categories of people, wasn't it?
Oh, I see. Well, some people have difficulties understanding it if they're too literal-minded, and there are people who are, neuroatypical, or whatever the correct phrase is, who don't get implicit meaning very easily.
So it's very hard for them to see anything other than the literal meaning.
Yes, and it's a difficult area to talk about, but that is right. That is very often the case, yes.
You mean it's difficult because it's kind of condemnatory, or...?
Well, yes, I mean, I never thought that a diagnosis was a condemnation.
No.
I have a
No,
diagnosis of depression, and like most people who are prone to depression, I survive on humour. And so I don't mind that fact. But anyway, where were we? We're talking about, yes, context. And just the recasting of something in reference to another idea. It's like, it's this thing my favourite joke at the moment is somebody told me there was a stand-up comedian, and he's saying, you know, it's very difficult being a stand-up comedian. I've really struggled. And when I told my friends that I wanted to do this, they just laughed at me. They're not laughing now. Just think it's bloody good.
I think this is very important, though, because, you see, if there are people and they can only see one meaning, that is why they're so sure they're right.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Because if you can see lots of meanings, you may not agree with them, but at least you can see them. But if you only see the one meaning, you're absolutely sure you're right. And I was very interested to read recently that Barry Goldwater, if you don't remember him, 1964, I was in New York when LBJ won, and Arizona was the only state Goldwater won. And he said how impossible it was dealing with evangelicals because they simply couldn't be moved. And I was thinking, why not? And I suddenly thought, well, if you only see one possibility, why would you think there are others?
A rather mechanistic cast of mind goes with fundamentalism. Yes. And there's research that shows that engineers who tend to be trained in a very mechanistic way of thinking.
And doctors. Doctors.
What?
Doctors.
Not really, no.
Well, really? I never came across a doctor who was anything other than scornful of my interest in psi, except
Excuse
for you.
me?
I know, but you're a professor too.
No, I don't agree with...
Makes you much better than an ordinary common doctor.
No. In the Royal College of Psychiatrists, there are special interest groups. And the biggest one of all is the Spirituality Special Interest Group.
No? No.
And followed by the Philosophy Interest Group. And I'm a member of both. And I think, no, the doctors I know had marvellous sense of humour. In fact, if you don't have a sense of humour, you can't survive the pressures of a hospital job. And I remember as a young man, well, I was already a very old man, but I was young in terms of being a hospital doctor. I was a junior, but I was ancient. And I already had a couple of children under the age of 3, and I was working 120 hours a week, including looking after a neuro high care unit. And I had a junior guy who was lovely. He's become an orthopedic surgeon, an Irish chap. I won't mention his name, but he was very companionable. And it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, I think we can probably, you know, catch an hour's sleep or something. And he said, but don't you think we should cruise by that terminal dude? And and this wasn't in any way. See, this is what people don't. Oh, offensive. It's not at all. It was endearing, really, and it just helped me. I said, yes, I do think we do. And he was a very compassionate doctor, and I hope I was too. But not having a sense of humour is to be a crap person.
And also, you see, if you don't understand irony and you don't understand a metaphor, and you don't understand comic exaggeration, you're missing out on a whole range of meaning. And yet these are exactly the people who are trying to say, oh, you shouldn't make jokes about that.
Well, when I meet these people, the irony enters into my soul. And I hope it enters into theirs occasionally. But no, this is a problem, isn't it?
Because I think it's a terrible problem.
You talk about...
I want to actually write something in due course, possibly with the help of 1 or 2 people in this room, about the idea of literal thinking. because it's so deep in
Yes,
some cultures, and it is so harmful, because I think most of the problems with religion come when people take literally what was supposed to be understood metaphorically.
Yes. It's a complicated area, that one, but I broadly agree.
Well,
yes,
it's not that complicated.
Well,
come along.
I'd love to think it was simple, but I can't. But no, I mean, what interests me is that, you know, I believe that if you look at the way the left hemisphere sees the world as certain, fixed, abstracted, decontextualized, non-unique, general in nature, mechanical, and so on, then you automatically think you know it all, because you don't allow in the things that don't already conform with the way you think. And so you get the famous Dunning-Kruger effect, that the more you know, the more you realize how little you know, and the less you know, the more you think you got it all. But they also had another rather nice experiment in which they showed that when you show somebody who already believes a certain point of view, that the outcomes of implementing this policy have been very different from the ones they anticipated, they don't go, oh, all right, well, let's change track. Instead, they redouble their efforts and say, obviously, we haven't done enough of it. And you can see this in management, in universities, in hospitals, in the institutions that I know about, where this machine thinking has taken over, and it doesn't doubt itself. And it has no room for irony, no room for humanity, no room for real warmth. Substitute for warmth is correct opinions. But I've noticed, and maybe other people have also found this, that in life there are people who have all the correct opinions but have very little human warmth. And there are people who have rather incorrect opinions, but they're very warm and decent human beings. So it's a complicated world.
Well, I think when I read your book to begin with, that was one of the things that interested me, is that I've known a number of intellectuals, and some of them, not a large proportion, are amongst the most unhappy people I've ever come across. They have no fun at all. And I suddenly realized that if you become entirely left brain, you lose meaning above all, but you also lose humor. Yeah. Any kind of jokes is regarded as trivial. And I think one of the problems is we don't distinguish between what's solemn and what is serious, because we could be talking about something quite serious like what we're talking about now and still laughing without making it less serious. Whereas if we're trying to be solemn because it's a state funeral, then it is good manners not to put whoopee cushions on all the pews.
I think there's nothing that is so serious that it is exempt from the possibility of humor. And the big mistake we make is that if you're literal-minded and you don't understand humor, you think that it's aggressive. But in fact, almost all humor, I mean, there are people, I never actually saw him, but I think Bernard Manning was probably an example of somebody who was probably not very funny and used humor aggressively. But most humor actually builds bridges. And being teased, I mean, you and I have talked about this, that for an English person, some of your deepest friends will call you, you know, McGilchrist, you old fart, or whatever. And if they started being terribly careful and polite with me, I think, have I alienated them in some way? And so humor is, in fact, being able to share a joke immediately lowers the tension between parties that are otherwise sure that they must be right and the other person must be wrong.
Well, one of their arguments, the very, very extreme woke, is that all humor's critical, and they're right. Because if you wrote a character who was really intelligent and kind and thoughtful and considerate, it wouldn't be funny, you see. It's only when you get into deeply flawed people like Basil Fawlty that they become funny. That was Bergson, wasn't it? You remember?
Yes.
He's talking about any kind of mechanical or humor, which I mean sort of not appropriate behavior. That's funny. If it's appropriate, it's not funny. So they say, but all humor is critical. And what you can say to them is it all depends whether it's nasty or friendly. Because I can tell a story, I can say something like, why do Italian men grow moustaches? And the answer is, it's because they want to look like their mothers. It doesn't mean we hate Italians. You see what I mean? We don't hate Italians, but we just...
We love them. Yes, yes.
It helps if you don't like them. Like I have a joke, which is, why do the French have so many civil wars? It is so that they can win one now and again. But it doesn't really mean you hate the French, even if we do.
No.
But what I'm getting at is that the joke can be seen to be aggressive, or it can actually be seen as not aggressive at all and just affectionate teasing.
Yes, yes.
And affectionate teasing is fine, but you won't find any of the extreme woke people agreeing with that.
In some ways, the problem is that the people who are most judgmental about humor are the very people who are least in a position to be judgmental about it, because they don't get it. They don't understand its nature. So anyway, I suppose we ought to ask people to
Of course.
give us questions.
The more
Make our lives difficult.
The more aggressive, the better. Hang on a second.
Oh, sorry. John Cleese's humor, especially in Faulty Towers, is so much about tone, facial expression, posture. He doesn't tell jokes, but you're wetting yourself, you know, from all of those somehow subtle signals that make you just laugh so much, facial expressions. It must be a part of the brain, right, that he's got developed.
It's all the implicit stuff: body language, tone of voice, irony, reversal of meaning. All these things are not pickable up by the left hemisphere, which tends to be very literal about it all. So I agree with that.
Do you remember a scene in Faulty Towers where I beat my own car?
Oh, who could forget it?
You know, I took
You vicious bastard!
I beat it. Well, you see, what is so complicated about humor is that the first time we shot that, I went and broke off a branch somewhere, and I went and hit the car with it, and it wasn't at all funny. And it was because the branch was too rigid. Then I went and got a floppier branch, and that wasn't funny either, because it was too floppy. And then I got one that was sort of in between and hit the car with that, and it was absolutely hilarious.
That's incredible.
Now, how do you fit that into a philosophy of humor?
I wouldn't dare try, but I must tell you that after I saw that particular episode, I remember where I was and when. I went to sleep laughing, and I woke myself up in the morning laughing. So what an effect you had on me.
Well, this is the thing I'm trying to say, that really good comedy improves people's lives. It can lift their mood when they're, you know, it can help to put things in proportion. Because there's no question that comedy is something to do with a sense of proportion. And I guess it's because you can laugh at things. My old friend Paddy Ashdown, who used to run the Liberal Party, told me that when he was in special boats, on one occasion he and his special boats companions were being bombed by their own planes. One guy was complaining, and the officer said, "Look, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined up." But when that's made, it lifts you in some strange way. You know, you can cope better. And I think we must be really try and block the extreme woke people, because they are winning in a lot of areas, especially in American universities, where their influence is very, very strong. And it's not that they're not trying to be good. They are trying to be good, but they're like the Puritans who were trying to be good in England under Oliver Cromwell when they banned Christmas puddings because they were idolatrous. You know, that kind of thinking doesn't really cheer anyone up. John.
Yes, John, thank you. Both of you have put humor into a family to which I agree it belongs: poetry, metaphor. And I've published on metaphor and insight and flow. So I'm going to ask the other question, the one that bedevils me. How is humor different from a good metaphor. Because when I read Rilke, I don't break out laughing. Or when I'm in the flow state doing Tai Chi Chuan, I don't double up in laughter, right? And this perplexes me because I see the similarities you're both pointing to, but there also has to be some relevant difference that brings out this very unique response.
Well, I'd say, if I may, that a metaphor where something that naturally fits with it, but we just hadn't thought of at the time, doesn't make you laugh. It just makes you expand your idea of what it is that's being metaphorized. But in humor, essential to it is there is a union and a division. So if some things have been brought together that are profoundly incongruous, and it's out of that incongruity that the humor arises, we're pleased and delighted to have suddenly seen the world in a different way.
So does that place it close to the phenomena of absurdity, where things are incongruous and we can't reconcile them in some way?
Sorry, the what of
The
what?
phenomena of absurdity, when people are finding, and I don't mean like in a funny sense, I mean when people are beset by absurdity, and they feel like, because I study meaning in life, and
Yes.
people sometimes complain, I think the world is absurd, and
Yes.
they're not being funny. They're not being funny. Is it because there's an in some major degree of things being incongruous that they can't reconcile with humor?
Well, I imagine that if you only see incongruity but refuse to be amused by it, then I can't help you and nobody else can. It's seeing that incongruity, or that absurdity, and being able to laugh at it. I mean, I think it was Voltaire probably, I can't remember. It was an 18th century Frenchman who said, life is a comedy to those who think, but a tragedy to those who feel. And I think there's some truth in that, but the great delight is in feeling the tragedy, and there's nothing better than feeling the tragedy and finding the thing funny, rather like your people in Sarajevo. These things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they somehow intensify one another.
Following a little on that, I've always been really fascinated with the very subtle suspension between humor and horror. Indigenous humor is really, really ingrained in communities, because that has helped so much with tragedies, right? And it's part of becoming resilient as well, and responding to the horrors that we can carry.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that people have different thresholds for what they can laugh at. You see, when we did Fish Called Wanda, if some of you have seen that, you remember that at one point, for example, Michael Palin was trying to kill an old lady and instead squashed his dog. Now, people howl with laughter at that. I mean, they scream with laughter. And yet, if they saw a dog being squashed, they'd be appalled. And we made a mistake right at the start, because when Charlie Crichton, the director, was doing the close-up of the flattened dog, we had this sort of raffia mat dog, and he actually put a handful of innards from a local butcher on the top. And when we showed that, the audience was howling with laughter and absolutely killed them, stone dead, because they suddenly saw the blood. It suddenly became real. And I think some people can see an idea as actually happening, and other people can look at it as real. So if they're laughing at someone in a comedy, it's because they're not taking it seriously at some level. They know this isn't happening in reality.
I just wanted to comment on something you told me about your plans. And I'm probably more than a cultural Christian. I think there's enormous value in what I think I understand by Christianity. Unbelievable value, and I think it's a wondrous, in the real sense of the word, myth. And I'm not saying it's false by using the word myth. It's exalting it. But we were talking. I said, "What are you doing, John?" And he said, "Oh, we're adapting the life of Brian for the stage." I bet you've done it now, yeah. And he said, "There is rather a problem, though, having 3 people crucified on stage. So we had to change it a bit." And I said, "Well, how did you change it?" And he said, "Well, it goes like this. Pilate says, 'Take him away and have him crucified.' And a henchman goes, 'No, can't do it.' And he says, 'What do you mean you can't do it?' 'No wood.' They were going to deliver on Monday. And then he went forward and said, 'Oh, well, what are we going to do?' 'Well, I suppose we could boil him in oil, or we could tear him limb from limb.' And the Brian figure leans forward and says, 'Just like to put in a word for crucifixion.' And I mean, I don't know about other people, I'm not offended, even though I take Christianity very seriously and think it's a wonderfully
But also
nourishing thing. Why can't we
about-
laugh as well? I mean,
We're talking about the most terrible things.
Exactly.
You know, and that we're laughing at them because they're not real, and we can see the difference.
Yes.
Between them being real. I forgot to add that one of the reasons we got away with killing the dogs was that they were Yorkshire Terriers. If they had been German Shepherds, I would not be here today to tell the tale. You know?
They could have been Scotties. I think that might have been a good outcome. Yeah?
That would have been more popular, yeah. We've got a question here. Philip?
I think it's...
Question, yeah.
Anil.
Yeah, thanks. It's really something that's following from what you said. I'm very interested in method, and you've given a few beautiful examples of how you landed on, this wasn't funny and then this was funny. The branches weren't quite the right hardness, and the dog could have been different. When I sort of look at a piece of art, it just appears as a whole, and it's perplexing to me how somebody could have created it.
Yeah.
But there's always methods behind it, and I'm just fascinated by, in comedy in general, and in your experience in particular, what's the recipe?
The recipe is being able to play in a certain way. When Graham Chapman and I were stuck, I used to pull out the thesaurus and start throwing words at him. And I'd say cucumber, and we say, no, not really, and then reality. And then I read out plummet. Graham said, "Oh, I like plummet." I said, "It's a good word, isn't it?" Yes. I said, "What would plummet?" He said, "A sheep would plummet." I said, "What do you mean a sheep would plummet?" He said, "If it tried to fly, it would plummet." So you play in this ridiculous way. And what happens is after you've been at it quite a long time, you get much better at suddenly knowing that'll be funny. That won't be. This will be funny. And then life becomes much easier, because at the beginning, when you're writing on your own, you don't know whether what you've come up with is funny or whether it's just amusing to you. And the thing about Chapman was he was like a litmus paper. If he laughed, the audience was going to laugh. And then after a long time, you get to know it. And then it's very hard to systematize comedy, which is, I think, why it's difficult to do well. And if you try to make rules, there's always exceptions, and that they don't work. But I seem to know now, as somebody's doing a scene and I'm directing it, I will say to them, stand about a foot closer together, and it'll suddenly become funnier. I have no idea where that knowledge comes from, but it's 40, 50 years of doing it.
Yes.
And I think all those lessons get stored in the unconscious, and then they come up when you're dealing with the situation for no other reason. They make me laugh. You see, there was an experiment some time ago which I was fascinated by, which was some academic psychologists showed a group of people some Chinese ideograms, and then the next week they said, we're going to show you some new ones and some you saw last week. And unsurprisingly, nobody could say which ones they'd seen the previous week. Absolutely hopeless. It was pure chance. Then they repeated the experiment. And the second time, they, instead of saying, we're going to show you some you saw last week, they said, we're going to show you some, we just want you to say if you like them or not. If you just look at them and think, well, that's a nice shape, or no, I don't like that shape so much. And what they found was the ones they liked were the ones they'd seen the previous week. Now that means that that knowledge is stored down there somewhere, but the difficulty is you can't address it directly. You can't just say, tell me the answer. You have to say something like, how do they strike you? Well, I like them better. And that's how you get to the information you want. And that fascinates me, absolutely fascinates me, is how you can get to that information. And it's paradoxical because you know when you can't think of a name and you try too hard to pursue it, you can't get it, and then 3 minutes later it just pops in your mind like that. Well, what's the explanation of that? But it's down there if only you can contact it.
Well, I'd say there are two things about that. One is that, I think I've mentioned before, that practically all psychological information that we have is not readily accessible. We work with what is useful at the time, and Bergson's idea, which I think is a good one, is that the brain is a filter. I mean, it's my view as well, and that the brain is actually screening out the stuff that's not useful to you. But it doesn't mean the information isn't there. And one of the things that happens when you can't find a word is that you begin effortfully to recruit your attention on something. And by doing that, you recruit particularly left hemisphere circuits that are narrowly concentric. They're much more broadly distributed in the right hemisphere than they are in the left. And when you relax, you then take your attention off it, and it's allowed to come up into awareness.
So you can't order it about or hit it with a stick. You have to learn with the unconscious, and this is the basis of my little book on creativity. You have to learn how to work with it, how to sort of coax it and encourage it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, the idea that there could be a formula for this is ridiculous, any more than there could be a formula for being creative. Yeah. The only formula is the formula of having no formula. And that's often the case. And I think it would be the case, obviously, with humor.
Well, when
Once it's mechanized and, what's the word, operationalized, then, as it were, this very limited vision of how things should be and how they're achieved, which is more typical, I'm afraid, of the left hemisphere, comes into play. Anil is dying to say something.
No, I think there's a middle ground. I think the formula is different from a method, right? There's no like completely unambiguous set of rules by which you will know something will be funny. Just in the same way, there's no unambiguous set of rules which mean this will be a great poem or indeed a great experiment.
Yes.
But it's also I think when you were talking about these experiments, I mean, we've done some of this stuff in my lab on grammar learning, artificial grammar learning, and it seems to be a parallel with grammar here. I know when an English sentence is grammatical, but I don't know the rules of English grammar. Right. Yeah. But the grammatical knowledge is in there somewhere. It has to be accessed indirectly. And what you were describing was a kind of a process. To me, I read that as a process for learning the grammar of comedy, which becomes inaccessible in exactly the same way that my grammatical knowledge of English.
It's interesting. You see, when I first got interested in comedy, someone at Sussex, Brian Bates, said I was to read some research that had been done in the 70s at Berkeley by a guy called McWhinney, I think his name was. And he was fascinated with architects, and he went round all the architects and said, what do you do from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment that you go to bed at night? And he did that, first of all, with all the ones who were regarded by their contemporaries as very creative. And then he went round, although he didn't tell them, and asked the same question to a bunch of architects who were in no way outstandingly creative. And there were only two differences. The architects who were very, very creative knew how to play. And the ones who didn't know how to play. And the other thing is that the creative people always postponed the moment of decision as long as they could. They were not oblivious of the outside world. And when I read that they play, I read a book called Homo Ludens by, what's his name? The waning of the Heisinger, the waning of the Middle Ages. And he was defining what play, and he says play has to be separate from ordinary life. A bit like a football match, if you see what I mean, because the players are separate on the pitch, and when the whistle goes, a certain lot of rules take over that go on taking over until the whistle goes at the end, and then you're back to ordinary life again. And that's why in the creativity book, I'm saying what you have to do is to get away from ordinary life. You've got to be away from interruptions, because interruptions are absolute death to creativity.
And in psychology, psychiatry, and creativity, in all these areas, it's much more important to say what people should not do than what they should do. And we have this idea that negation is, well, negative. But actually negation, limitation, resistance to things is actually how things come into being. I've said something about this before, so I won't repeat that. But often when somebody's got a problem in psychological or psychiatric realm, you can't tell them what to do, but you can say, but what you're doing is this, isn't it? You recognize you repeatedly do this. How about just simply not doing that and giving room for something to happen? And I think creativity is like, to come back to a metaphor earlier today, gardening, in the sense that no gardener can make a plant or make it grow. Their choices are to stifle the plant or not to stifle the plant. And if you want not to stifle the plant, you move the weeds out and give it space and so on. But the plant does the growing. And we are organisms, and these kinds of thinking are organic. They're not rule-following. And when I wrote my very first book called Against Criticism, I was talking to a Chinese scholar, a lovely, modest, kind man called David Hawkes, now sadly no longer with us. And he put me on to the fact that there's an important tract from about the 3rd century in China in which the writer talks of the method of no method. And this seemed to me absolutely key to what I was trying to communicate, is that all our systematic approaches were misguided. I think I'm getting the message that we probably need to wrap up.
We have one last question.
Okay.
Very quickly, two very quick things. One thing on
What do you mean, two? Everyone else had
I don't know which to ask now.
Greedy.
Just on the worries people have about comedy being aggressive, and something that's often said in this context, and I don't know whether I agree with it. I suspect you two won't agree with it, but I'm curious. People often say we should distinguish punching up and punching down, and one's okay and one's not. I'm curious, what do you think? Also, the connection between comedy and wisdom is an intuitive connection to me there, and I can never make sense of it, even though it's very intuitive. Sorry, I got in the two.
Can't make sense of what?
I don't know. There seems to be a connection between sense of humour and wisdom that I've never been able to fathom.
I absolutely agree. Well,
I slipped in two things. Sorry, I'm bad.
I were asked that. I'd say that it has to do with wisdom not being following rules, making decisions according to foreknown principles, but having a broad enough view to see things in a very broad context, and therefore to be wise about the choices that you make. And so wisdom and humor are very much close together. And one of the things I like about certain strands in Buddhism, including Zen Buddhism, is that humor is part of spiritual practice, and things that seem absurd are themselves liberating. So I think there's a deep connection there.
What about punching up and punching down?
Say again?
What about punching up and punching down? Some people say comedy should always be
Well,
punching up,
I think
not
it's a
down.
question of whether people are rude or not. I think there's nothing wrong with criticism, but if they're just plain rude, there's no reason you shouldn't punch down.
No.
All right?
Well, You and Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett did some sketches, didn't you, in which you were the upper class chap
Oh, yeah.
with the bowler hat. And
I
so
looked down on him.
Yes,
Yeah.
And they were all in a train together. And what are you doing? I'm doing the Mephisto crossword. You said, the upper class man. And then the little man, who was, I think, Ronnie Corbett, said, "Oh, I'm doing the sun crossword. 4 letters, something you find in the bottom of a birdcage, ends in IT." And oh, grit, that's it. I mean, in a way, those jokes were based on recognizing differences, but they were affectionate and they weren't stupid. And, you know, anyway.
It's a question of just being playful. Yeah. And when people are in a playful state of mind, and therefore in a creative state of mind, you always find there's a lot of humor. It's as though you've got to deliberately get rid of the humor if you're in that kind of atmosphere, because the natural thing about that kind of atmosphere is that it's intrinsically humorous, because everybody's playing at the same level. I mean, what I love about humor is it's very democratic. Very pompous, self-important people hate humor because in a humorous atmosphere they can't get away with it, you see?
Very true.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.